Funds for this program are provided by the Literature Program of the National Endowment for the Arts.
I came and found a rose, left for dead, heaped with the hopeless dead, its petals still supple. Of my brothers, one would have ignored it, another ravished it, the third would have pinned it to his chest and swaggered home. My sister would rival its beauty, my mother bow before it, then bear it to my father's grave, where he would grant it 7 days, then return and claim it forever. I took it, put it in water, and set it on my windowsill.
Chicago, crossroads of America. Poet Lee Young Lee lives here on the north side of town in this three-family house.
Give me another plate. Do you have a plate?
Lee lives with his wife and 2 sons. He shares the house with the families of his older sister and brother.
I'm okay. Hey, you guys better be careful. I used a different curry. This is hot.
This is a resting place in an extraordinary family odyssey. Lee Young Lee was born in Jakarta, Indonesia in 1957. His parents were Chinese aristocrats. When the last emperor was ousted at the turn of the century, Lee's great-grandfather on his mother's side became the first president of the People's Republic of China. As a young man, Lee's father was personal physician to Mao Zedong. In 1951, he left China to found a medical school in Indonesia. When Sukarno came to power 7 years later, Lee's father was seized as a political prisoner. He was detained for 19 months, including a stay in a leper colony. In 1959, the family escaped. For 5 years, they wandered in exile from country to country. They finally settled in Pennsylvania, where Lee's father studied theology and became a Presbyterian minister. The poems in Lee Young Lee's first book, Rose, are about family history and the poet's relationship with his father.
So you were born in Jakarta in 1957. When did your family's and your father's ordeal and problems with Sukarno occur?
Okay, in 58, a man named, I believe his name was Dariush, he was a lieutenant, was put into power while Sukarno kind of stepped back. And the man just ran rampant. He locked up Chinese. And so it was about 1958 that it began with my father. He was taken away. And I remember growing up thinking this was very normal. You have a father who's never there and your mother goes to visit him in prison. I thought all children, you know, grew up like that. But in 1959, he began to be moved around a lot from one prison colony to another. So it was hard to keep track of him. My mother had to follow him. And finally, he was put into a leper colony for about 9 months. The whole ordeal was a little over 19 months. And finally, in about 1959 or 60, he escaped and took the family with him, and we left Indonesia. And we went to Hong Kong. We traveled through Singapore and Hong Kong, Japan.
You were still an infant when your family left Indonesia. What events do you actually remember from your early childhood?
Strangely enough, they're kind of hallucinatory scenes. I can't make any sense out of them. I I have a love for Muslim chants, and I never understood why. And of course, it's because every evening in Indonesia, the Muslims chant their prayers. So I have this lifelong love for just the sound of that. And I have incidences that I recall that don't make a lot of sense. Sometimes they're frightful for me. I recall sitting on my mother's lap in some kind of rickshaw or something and traveling, and I recall the way the shadows would fall evenly and at a pace, shadow and light, across my lap, and I would hear the moaning of what I thought were human beings. And of course, later on it was explained to me that this was a trip that we used to make to the prison to see my father, and we would go by the cattle slaughter business, and we could hear the cows moaning. But of course, I suppose it was the fear of going to visit my father in prison that I thought all of this, the cows in prison and my father in prison, it was all married in my mind and kind of confused. So I always harbored this frightful image.
And what do you remember about your father's escape and your family's exodus?
Well, my father attributes it to God. He said it was a miraculous escape. I remember that he came. He used to come. He used to escape frequently. There'd be a knock at the door at night. We'd open the door and there'd be my father. And he would come in. Of course, he'd look worse and worse each time. He was emaciated after a while and beaten and so on and so forth. But we would have a party. He would tell the servants to cook food, we would play music, and then the next morning he would be taken away again. He would be found. One night he came, he said, this is it, this is for good, we're leaving. So we packed everything up. He had passports, false passports, and we left and we waited at the dock for the ship to come in. And we finally got on the boat, and about a mile out of harbor, an Indonesian gunboat pulled up, and the soldiers boarded and said, we're looking for a particular person. They made everybody line up, and they went down the line, looking at the person's face, looking at the person's photo. When he got to my father, he looked down at me and my brother standing there, and he said, these two are Indonesian boys. Don't forget to bring them home. And he forgot to look at my father's passport, and he moved to the next person. So my father attributes that to God clouding the soldier's brain. But that's how we escaped, and we made our way. We were going to Hong Kong, but we got news that the boat was not going to go to Hong Kong. It was going to go to Macau, because they found out my father was on board. So they were going to dock in Macau, and they would pick him up there. So the boat stopped about 3 miles out of Hong Kong's harbor, and they were waiting to get papers and this and that to divert the journey. And a small boat pulled up beside the larger boat, and one of my father's ex-students boarded, and he said he was looking for somebody, and the person wasn't there. And the guy had chartered this boat. It was an empty boat. And he saw my father, and he said, hey, I thought you were dead, You better get out. You better get off this boat. They're waiting for you in Macau. So we boarded the little boat, and we went into Hong Kong, and that's how we ended up.
Was your family ever able to take any money with you when you left? I mean, did you have any possessions?
Yeah, we had some possessions. My mother sewed money into our coat linings. She sewed money into a doll that my sister had, the clothes of the doll, and put money inside the doll's head, and all the classic schemes. And she took a lot of precious stones that she owned. And when we first came to Hong Kong, she was pawning a lot of those stones off so that we could survive. These days I waken in the used light of someone's spent life to discover the birds have stripped my various names of meaning entire. The sparrow by quarrel, the dove by grievance. I lie dismantled, I feel the hours. Do they veer to dusk or dawn? Will I rise and go out into an American city or walk down to the wilderness sea? I might run with wife and children to the docks to bribe an officer for our lives and perilous passage. Then I'd answer in an oceanic tongue to professor, capitalist, husband, father. Or I might have one more hour of sleep before my father comes to take me to his snowbound church, where I dust the pews and he sets candles out the color of teeth. That means I was born in Bandung, 1958. On my father's back, in borrowed clothes, I came to America. And I wonder if I imagined those wintry mornings in a dim nave, since I'm the only one who's lived to tell it. And I confused the details. Was it my father's skin which shone like teeth? Was it his heart that lay snowbound? But if I waken to a jailer rousting me to meet my wife and son, come to see me in my cell where I smoke the cigarettes and eat the chocolate they smuggle, what name do I answer to? And did I stand on the train from Chicago to Pittsburgh so my fevered son could sleep? Or did I open my eyes and see my father's closed face rocking above me? Memory revises me. Even now a letter comes from a place I don't know, from someone with my name and postmarked years ago, while I await injunctions from the light or the dark. I wait for shapeliness limned or dissolution. Is paradise due or narrowly missed? Until another 1,000 years, I wait in a blue hour and faraway sound of hammering, and on a page a poem begun, something about to be dispersed, something about to come into being.
So your father finally got his visa and you came to America. Where did you go?
He traveled throughout America again. We stayed in Seattle a few months, where he worked at the World's Fair, shaking hands at the Chinese exhibit. That's kind of funny, right? He was a man who loved Hebrew and Western culture and loved Western thinking and was classically educated in Chinese. And he was the token Chinese guy at the Chinese exhibit, shaking hands. But we lived in Maryland a while, and finally he enrolled in Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and we stayed in Pennsylvania for about 15 years.
So his scholarly interest became some sort of devotion.
Yeah, very much so.
And were you very devout? Did you read the scriptures?
Yeah, we were made to read the scriptures. As a matter of fact, it was through reading the scriptures that I thought, boy, this is poetry, this is power, you know. I remember in church hearing my father read from the pulpit, and these words, Psalms or Proverbs or whatever, Ecclesiastes, would roll off his tongue, and I would think the entire congregation is just rapt with attention. He was a great reader when he read out loud, and I thought to myself, that's great, that's power, that's beauty. And of course the responsive readings in Presbyterian services, where the minister reads a part and then the congregation reads a part. And then I thought, when I was witnessing this, there's the head of U.S. Steel over there, and there's the janitor of our local school over here, and they're all repeating together, "Let us make a joyful noise unto the Lord." And I thought, this is beautiful, you know. And I think at that point I realized literature is power and beauty.
And you were living in a small town in western Pennsylvania.
Right, we're living in a small town.
Which was called?
Vandergrift, Pennsylvania. They had two steel mills there, Allegheny Ludlam and U.S. Steel. It was very blue collar. They'd never seen an Oriental family. They called him the heathen minister.
What was your father like?
He was a difficult person, but extremely tender. I recall now he said something to me. He said, "You know the part in the Bible that says, 'Judge not lest ye be judged'?" And I responded, "Yes." He said, "That's wrong. Let me tell you what it should say. You can judge as long as you judge yourself the harshest. He told me this, I must have been 10 or 11. I don't think that's something you tell a 10 or 11-year-old, and that's the way he was. And I'm sure that that reflected the way he felt, that he could judge me, he could judge the world, as long as he was judging himself the hardest. And I think he did judge himself the hardest. He was very hard on himself. He had a case, I think, of self-grandiosity, self-apotheosis. At the same time, he had a bad case of self-loathing. I think he passed that on to us intact, you know. So it was difficult to be around him. And he was unpredictable, extremely passionate, extremely tender. He was given to rages. And speaking with God, once a day he'd be in his office, in his study, and the door would be closed, and we would all be told we'd have to be quiet. Your father is convening with God now. So I'm sure that added to the weight, the sense of oppression that we all felt.
In one of your poems you write, is this my father's life or mine? How strongly do you think your father's experiences and spirit are imprinted on your own character?
My sister says, you're most like father. She says that every time I lose my temper. She says that every time I'm tender with my children, or every time I'm tender with her or my wife, she says, you're most like your father. Then when I lose my temper, she says, you're most like your father. I don't know, but I know that when he died, I inherited his library. So reading through his books, all his Bibles, and reading the marginalia, I really began to get a sense of his mind and his spirit. And he had kept a journal through most of his wandering and through his stay in prison. And I always tried to get my mother to read some of the journal to me, and she would never do it. She would read a few lines and then she would break into tears. But I would hold those journals. I can't read Chinese, but I would look at the writing, and I keep thinking I can get something just from the handwriting, trying to imagine the man who made those Chinese figures. And then I read his books, and I think about the father I knew. I think about his voice. I think about the experiences we had. And I think at some point he was me. That's the only way. It seems strange. Or let me put it this way. Sometimes I have the sense that there's another me still wandering around in Southeast Asia with his father, a boy of about 4 years old. Still wandering from country to country. His father's carrying this trunk on his back. I have this image in my mind. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I see it. This man carrying this trunk full of books on his back and holding a 4-year-old boy by the hand, and they're just wandering from country to country. I have this sense that there's another me that's doing that. And this life that I live here in America seems so disconnected, as if something happened, something changed, and I'm an American citizen now. I'm comfortable. I don't live in terror. I don't live in fear. And yet I remember scenes of terror and scenes of fear. So my father's life and my life, I don't know, they kind of blend together, and I can't distinguish them sometimes. I think that's what I was trying to say in those two lines. To pull the metal splinter from my palm, my father recited a story in a low voice. I watched his lovely face and not the blade. Before the story ended, he had removed the iron sliver I thought I'd die from. I can't remember the tale, but hear his voice still, a well of dark water, a prayer. And I recall his hands, 2 measures of tenderness he laid against my face, the flames of discipline he raised above my head. Had you entered that afternoon, you would have thought you saw a man planting something in a boy's palm, a silver tear, a tiny flame. Had you followed that boy, you would have arrived here, where I bend over my wife's right hand. Look how I shave her thumbnail down so carefully she feels no pain. Watch as I lift the splinter out. I was 7 when my father took my hand like this, and I did not hold that shard between my fingers and think, metal that will bury me, christen it little assassin, or going deep for my heart. And I did not lift up my wound and cry, death visited here. I did what a child does when he's given something to keep. I kissed my father.
When did poetry become a passion for you?
You know, not really until about 7 years ago. I went to graduate school and I did all the things I was supposed to do, but I don't think I ever, I never had the sense that I wanted to be spent by poetry. Not until about 7 years ago when Don and I came to Chicago. I worked in a warehouse part-time. Donna worked and supported us mostly. And suddenly I had the sense that I had to compete with John Milton. I was reading Paradise Lost. I remember one year we were going to see the Nutcracker. I was totally oblivious to everything. I was reciting the catalog of rivers, you know, in Paradise Lost. I wanted to be Milton. I wanted to be John Donne. I think at that point, I took poetry really seriously. I didn't care about publication or whatever. I wanted to be consumed. I wanted to be kissed on the brain.
And in fact, you had a measure of suffering in your art. You sacrificed your personal life to your art.
Yeah, I went through about 7 years where I imposed a punishing schedule on myself. I had this crazy dream. I still have it, I suppose, that if I read 5 books a week, that if I was very good, that if I memorized as many poems as I could, that if I lost sleep, if I didn't take care of myself, if I devoted myself entirely, in other words, if I served beauty on my knees, that God would come down someday, kiss me on the back of the head, and I would have a poem. And this went on for years. Finally, one day I passed out on the living room floor. I had heart palpitations. Donna was frantic, and she said, "You have to stop this." I said, "Okay, I'll stop it." And of course, after I got better, I got right back on the schedule. I had 3 hours of sleep a night. Exactly 3 hours. I couldn't have more. I couldn't survive on less. And I was drinking 14 cups of coffee a day. And of course, the idea, nobody could read 5 books a week at that point and get anything from those books. But I wasn't out to get anything. I was just out to suffer. I was out to assume the posture of supplicant, of vulnerability. I happen to believe that that's a good posture to write poetry. The posture of prayer, finally. It's a posture of vulnerability and supplication, suffering.
Tell me about your poem, Always a Rose.
About a year before I wrote the first line, I thought to myself, enough fooling around. I want to be entirely spent on one project, on one poem. It would have to be long. It would have to be spiritually and emotionally taxing. I would have to bring the entire weight of my being onto this poem. At that point, I had no use for any other kind of poem that I was writing, so I wanted to be spent. So maybe that accounts for some of the obsessive quality in the poem. But I was also reading a lot of the devotional poets of the 17th century, English poets. And of course I was reading the Chinese poets who loved flowers. And we were going through a very difficult time. I didn't have a job. Donna was working. We had 2 children. We were living in a studio. It was a very small studio. We never had any money, this and that. And maybe this turning inward was a kind of, it's probably an immodest thing to admit. It was a kind of turning away from the difficulties that were before me. I never shirked my family, but I turned deeply inward. And so it's a very inward poem, I think, intensely lyrical. Listen now to something human. I know moments measured by a kiss or a tear, a pass of the hand along a loved one's face. I know lips that love me, that return my kisses by leaving on my cheek their salt. And there is one I love who hid her heart behind a stone. Let there be a rose for her, who was poor, who lived through 10 bad years and then 10 more, who took a lifetime to drain her bitter cup. And there is one I love, smallest among us. Let there be a rose for him, who was driven from the foreign schoolyards by fists and yelling, who trembled in anger in each retelling, who played alone all the days, though the afternoon trees were full of children. And there is one I love who limps over this planet, dragging her steel hip. Always a rose for her, and always a rose for one I love, lost in another country, from whom I get year-old letters. And always a rose from one I love, exiled from one republic and daily defeated in another, who was shunned by brothers and stunned by God, who couldn't sleep because of voices, who raised his voice, then his hand against his children going. For him a rose, my lover of roses and of God, who taught me to love the rose, and fed me roses, under whose windows I planted roses, for whose tables I harvested roses, who put his hand on my crown and purified me in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, who said, "Get out, you're no longer my son," who never said, "Forgive me, why do I die? Hold me, hold me." My Father the Godly, he was the chosen, my Father Almighty, full of good fear, my Father exhausted, my beloved, my Father among the roses and thorns, my Father rose, my Father thorn.